many people will just leave it alone. They'll walk away from it. They won't think about it. They'll succumb to the alternate ideas. So that was interesting. So even if the experts will get, okay. Now, here's an interesting question for you. The book your church doesn't want you to read. And what it says is an enlightening anthology by world-renowned theologians. We have one of those right here in our midst here. By world-renowned theologians and exposing the challenges of misrepresentations. Now, the book your church doesn't want you to read. What's the first thing that some of you thought of when you saw that title? Better read it. That was the idea. Yeah, you think that you look at that. They're going to show you the misrepresentations of who Jesus was, and they're thinking that this is it. But we think, the church hasn't told me something. The church isn't telling me all the truth. Maybe I better read that and find out what I'm missing. Maybe my faith is misplaced. My gosh, but what is there a whole bunch of stuff out there I don't know about? That could be very dangerous. And when you go on to some of the rest of these, here's the Gospel of Thomas. And they describe it this way: to present Jesus unadulterated by the 2,000 years of myth and interpretation. So they want to present you a new Jesus, a different Jesus from the one we have, right? And I think do you think that's dangerous? I think that's a little dangerous. But this is the way these books are going, the Gospel of Thomas. It is a real book, has some interesting things in it. There are some truths in there. And this is the even greater danger. When we get presented something as partly truth and partly a lie, we tend to kind of lump the two together because we recognize those truths. Some of them are quotes from Scripture that we already know. We recognize those, and we very easily get sucked into attaching the lies with the rest of it as if it were truth. So just be aware of that. But there's lots and lots more. There we go. Here's just a few more. The infancy gospel of Thomas. Very interesting about when Jesus was a boy. These were written hundreds of years after Jesus' time. And there's some explanation. It might have been the Gnostics, might have been others. We don't know quite who wrote some of these things. But I hadn't even heard of that one until just a few years ago, an infancy gospel. And my neighbor, this is another reason to study apologetics, my neighbor said to me, that Jesus guy, he was quite a rascal, eh? A rascal. I wouldn't call him a rascal, but that's what he called him. And then he brought up this, and I had to go and look it up because I confess none of us really knows everything. So we have to learn, we have to study. So I did. I studied it up, found out a little bit more when it was written, some of the flaws in it. We have to do that because we're always going to be challenged by these kinds of things. The Gospel of Judas. The Gospel of Judas portrays that Jesus wasn't really the one crucified. He wasn't really, it was a substitutionary idea. You can ask some of your youth because they already know this. We've talked about it, right? Where are they? Some of them. So they know that. What are the three things? Can you guys tell me again? Could you remember? What are the three things that I told you need to know? Anybody? Jesus died, was buried, and rose again. You heard it from the youth, right? You heard it. They know Jesus died, he was buried, he was raised from the dead. So I said, when you run into weird problems in this kind of stuff, you could say to your neighbor, I don't know what you're reading, but, this I know. Jesus died, he was buried, he was raised from the dead. Start there. It's a good place to begin because that has irrefutable evidence to support it. So lots of different things. Mary Magdalene gets in there as well. So what is apologetics? There's many definitions. This is the one that I'm liking to use here. This is from Paul Gould. He says, we define apologetics as an attempt to remove the obstacles or doubts as well as offer the positive reasons for our faith, for believing that Christianity is true and satisfying. Okay, so deal with the negatives, answer it, give you the evidence about what's wrong with those negative arguments, give you favorable arguments that stand up and show the truth of Jesus Christ and his salvation of us. Okay, so that's what we're going to go for. So there's really two things. I mentioned there's lots of things we could cover. There's really just two primary topics. The first one is what does Scripture say? The second one is really what happens in regards to culture when people don't pay attention to the truth. Okay, so those are the two areas we're going to yield into. Well, Thomas is a good example. Thomas often gets kind of a bad rap. Doubting Thomas, we call him, right? Thomas is probably he's one of the really honest guys. He says, this whole stuff, he was in the room and they told him, Thomas, you weren't here, but Jesus returned. Jesus came back. He's alive. And what did Thomas say? Well, he said, not a chance. I'm not believing it. He didn't say you're lying, but he said, I won't believe that unless I can see it myself. I have to see it myself. See, Thomas was evidence-based, right? This lesson tells us that Thomas was smart enough to say, I want evidence. I want the evidence. When Jesus came back, he said, Thomas, you silly doubter. You should have believed what the other guys told you. He didn't say that. He came back and said, Thomas, put your finger here. Examine my hands. Extend your hand. Put it in my side. And don't continue in your unbelief. So what did Jesus offer him? Oh, he didn't scold him. He didn't, berate him. He didn't just say, well, you should have more faith. He didn't say that. He gave him evidence. Evidence. Look at my hand. Look at my side. So Jesus himself uses this principle of evidence, right? And so what else did Jesus do? Well, what happened when John the Baptist's disciples came to see Jesus? And they said, are you the one? Did Jesus actually answer yes or no? He didn't quite answer it the way they asked the questions. And instead, what he says is, go tell John what you have seen and what you have heard. Go tell John. There's evidence. The blind see, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, deaf hear, dead are raised, poor have good news proclaimed to them. Evidence. See, Jesus himself turns to this principle. He doesn't push them to just have faith. He pushes them to look at the evidence and have faith. Okay? This is about apologetics. Look at the evidence. Jesus' method of doing this is the same way. But again, they ask him later, and Jesus states, believe me that I'm in the Father, and the Father is me. But otherwise, believe because of the works themselves. So Jesus is saying, if you don't like what I'm saying, if you don't think that what I'm telling you makes sense, what do you got to do? Look at the evidence. Look at the evidence, okay? So this is part of it. The miracles. Jesus appealed to evidence to support reasonableness. Another one from Paul Gould. Okay, so what other scriptures do we have? The other scriptures, the apostles all give us the same kind of principle. In Peter, there's a message, and it basically says, be prepared to give an answer for the reason that you have hope. Be prepared. Be prepared. This is why we study apologetics. Jesus used this example, evidence-based. The apostles are using this example. The scriptures are telling us, be prepared to give an answer. So that's a good thing. Be prepared to give an answer. And I see April's here. I borrowed this from Mike's Facebook page. He put, God's truths are not bricks to throw at people. They are bread to feed people. And I think this is important too. As we talk about studying, getting your evidence, this is not to prepare to argue with people. That is not what you're preparing to do. You don't want to argue. You can never argue somebody's heart into the kingdom of God. You can't do that. So what do? You talk to them with grace, understanding, tolerance, patience. Alpha's a good example of that, leading graciously through the process of coming to grips with some truths. Okay, and the scripture here from Colossians, walk in wisdom towards outsider, making the best use of it. Let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer. So is Jesus saying, again, Paul in this case writing, are we to be prepared to give an answer? And Peter wrote it, Paul wrote it, right? Same ideas, okay? But not to argue people into it. Now, on the other hand, he didn't use the word argue here, but Paul wrote from Acts that Paul traveled through different towns. He went to all the synagogues, Thessalonica and others, and on the Sabbath he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that Christ had to suffer and rise again. So Paul's doing it. That's how he's doing it. That's how he's leading his ministry. He's presenting evidence. See, we're an evidence-based belief. Faith, yes. Grace, yes. Mercy, yes. All the good stuff that we don't even deserve and we get. And yet we're told there's evidence. So for the unbeliever, he's arguing here with unbelievers, And he's saying when we're doing that, we need to be looking at evidence. Okay? This is the most important thing. Now, this theme goes back to the Old Testament as well. And I had my thumb on the button. I don't know if I skipped slides, but you'll be lucky because you'll get out earlier if I miss some slides. So anyway, here's the other thing. I just talked about the New Testament examples, but you actually see this in the Old Testament. This is not a new idea, right? It's not a new idea. Teach me true understanding. And John Eaton translates this from this part of the Psalm 118. Teach me true understanding. Okay? That's the important part. So even back through the Old Testament, our idea in apologetics is to learn true understanding of the scriptures. We need to look at culture. We need to look at language. We need to look at how they're put together. We need to look at who was being talked to, how that was being done, what was going on, what was the outcome that Jesus desired, what was the outcome the prophets desired. Study it, understand it. Because if I just teach some things here this morning, you'll go home, you won't remember any of them. And that probably, except Mike's Facebook. That one you'll remember, right? Because why would you remember that? Well, I don't know. It's a good point. But again, back to the topic of those questions. See, we need to study it. You have to dig in. Serena would love it if you came back again and said, I was looking up this idea about woming, and here's what I found. What do you think? Because she preached on that. She would love it if you'd come back. Or if Jake said, here's the reasons that prayer doesn't get answered sometimes, and you come back and you go, yeah, I got another one I'd like to talk to you about. The pastors love that. Question them, challenge them, bring stuff back to them. Because if you study, you get more out of it. If you just sit here and let the word wash over you, it's very healthy. It's very good for you. It's delightful. You feel good about that. Sometimes we feel bad when the message is a little harder to deal with. But nonetheless, we go out of here and we've been washed by the word, but we didn't let it stick. Okay, so that's what I'm asking you. Go and get a book. In our library, we have some good books. In particular, easy to read books. Lee Strobel is a good example. We have several of his books in the library. Very easy to read. He asks questions of people. He gets answers. A number of other ones are very easy to read. And you can find those out. If you want really tough stuff, you move over to something maybe like N.T. Wright or some other ones. And they're I wouldn't advise those for the first readings. You have to dig a little deeper and understand a little broader before you get into somebody like N.T. Wright. But there's a whole spectrum of ideas here about what can be done. Okay, so here's an idea. So this is the second part of the idea. The first part, Scripture tells us to study. Scripture tells us to use evidence. Jesus used that method of explaining and based on evidence. So it's good enough for Jesus. I would say it's good enough for us. We should be thinking about that and preparing ourselves with answers and evidences. But here's the problem. Here's where we've gone. Now, this happened in the past as well, from Judges 17. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. This is what happens when we take our eyes off the truth. So when the Enlightenment came along, it became a rationalization of science and the use of these types of things put together, and we began to say everything's got to be rationalized. But even in the first era of Enlightenment and modernism, yes, it was becoming intellectual, rational. We could still have conversations. The church still had a place. Okay, the church still had a place. It was still looked at as often as authority. People got into trouble. They still came to church sometimes to look for answers, right? That was still going on in the modern era. But basically, they're looking for, their concept was we felt we were emerging from the dark ages of oppression by the church. They oppress the truth and make you walk in this little narrow line. So this was the Enlightenment. Let's take this off, and now we can be free to think and do other things, and we're not so much cloistered into a little place where we have a narrow idea and we have to live this way or else. So we were moving out of that. People began to get freedom. And yet there's still just one truth. Jesus replied, I am the way and the truth and the life. Jesus said that, but the Enlightenment and modern era began to move away from that. This is maybe 1930s-ish, 1940s-ish. And then we moved into something called the postmodern, which makes sense, comes after the modern. Postmodern. Now, here we really begin to see the stretching of the elastic band around truth and faith. The stretching is there. Because now, how many of you heard this, particularly from your kids? You can't tell me what to do, right? A very postmodern era, very postmodern. And this is an idea. I'm going to live my life, and there's no universal truth. Everything is relational. And now I'm in this situation where what is the church doing? Well, feelings and individuality and inclusivity became part of the church environment because this is what our culture was doing. So the church responded to the nature of culture, not by holding necessarily to the truth that Jesus taught, but to soften it all up. We began to soften it up. Now, do I believe in some aspects of, being prepared to work with people, being prepared to accept people, learning to understand people for who they are and what they do and how to love them? This is all important, and this was a good emphasis, perhaps, in some ways that came into the postmodern. But really, it's this idea that you can't trust any authority. There's no authorities. You can't trust the authorities. You can't trust the church. It's just a values choice. And most of the questions on the board at the back really came from that kind of an idea. It's just a values choice. You can do whatever you want. And in particular, the postmodern era develops this idea there's no sin. I can do what I want. There's really no sin. Nothing's sin. What do you mean sin? Just because I don't do something the same way you do it? That's not sin. That's just my way of doing it. So the postmodern has been a big challenge to the church. And in particular, many of us, and you can see I'm a little bit older than most of you, right? So many of us, we grew up in an era where the church was still representing truth. We understood that. We grew up with it. We go with the postmodern. We go, oh man, how can I believe that? But what happens to our youth? Our youth are growing up in this culture where everything's relative, and they get challenges all the time that come up through that way. Metamodern, there's a couple of different words for it. Some people just call it postmodern, but metamodern seems to be the one that's adapting. This is the one that's emerging now out of postmodern, because it always changes, right? So a little bit of the metamodern, and it is really confusing. It's a new movement. It deals with literature, fashion, photography, economics, politics, the sphere of human activity. It's serious, but it oscillates between polarities. Metamodern holds two different things at a time. You talk about kids in school today, you've heard the expression, the furries. They think they're animals. They won't answer unless you meow at them and things like that, right? And so they're being two things at once. But you even go back a ways if you talk about some of the psychoanalysis that goes on. Child, parent, adult, right? This idea that we're more than one person at a time. And we have to deal with that. So meta is very interesting, and it's just coming. It's coming out, but it's already been around. Okay, so just to be clear, truth isn't absolute anymore. It's been defined as a social construction. Every community is allowed to have its own view of truth. And there's absolutely no truth, they say, but it's relative to the community in which we participate. Okay, so that's why we do get different types of questions. Nietzsche, reality has now become a mere bunch of disparate, changing interpretations, a shifting, loosely held coalition of points of view in a continual debate with each other. So this is the whole mix of ideas. Now, a couple of other interesting things. Here's just two things, just when you start to pick apart a little bit about the metamodern. Two interesting things I found. The first one, they were talking about AI chatbots. You've all heard about the AI chatbots, different types, right? AI chatbots. What they found out, this was from a science magazine. This isn't just somebody's weird radical opinion. From a science magazine, they said, instructing an AI chatbot to answer questions as if it were in the TV show Star Trek seems to improve its math ability. Although no one's sure exactly why. So, yeah, I like Star Trek. Star Trek's great. But our reality here, the AI, is now learning, and it's seeing Star Trek as a greater reality and a greater help at understanding things than our actual culture. Now, here's another one. I love this one. I thought this was so cute. Now, what does equals mean? When you see 2 + 2 = 4, now, I grew up with that. That's not a problem. 2 + 2 is 4, right? What does equals mean? And now that they're working, again, with AI, with computers, with mathematical, with very advanced maths, they're finding out they can't explain what equals means. Does that kind of bother you a little bit? Have you all grown up? We know what equals means, right? But now they can't explain it to a computer. It's become so complicated that it's like, man, I don't know. How does 2 and 2 turn into 4? So this is the generation with AI and other things where the metamodern is coming in to take place. We can't understand this, but this is again published from a science magazine, right? It's a science. They're saying that. And the debate's been simmering for decades, and they're trying to make proofs checkable by computer programs, and they're finding out they can't do it. They're having trouble with that. 2 + 2 = 4. And AI can't quite handle that concept. Okay, so this is metamodern. This is what your youth are growing up with. This is what they're involved in right now. So that's just an idea. I just wanted to do that to give you an idea of that. So where does all this go? What's the consequence for this in the church? What's the consequence of these ideas? Well, some Barna studies. Some of you are familiar with Barna. He does research specifically, primarily in the US, I believe. There may be some broader pictures, but they're always doing surveys, researches, putting them together. Barna is a pretty reliable source for information. And a 5-year study, in this case, that was done, and 6 in 10 young people leave the church begins at age 15. Begins at age 15. This is when they're coming into their own ideas, their own findings. So for all of you who have 15-year-old pluses in here, parents, congratulations, because they're still here. Okay, you're doing the right thing, because if your kids are still here and even older than 15, then thank you, parents, for helping out. Okay, so that's part of it. But they gave 6 reasons in particular. But the comment is here is if the church would like to begin to take the life of the mind more seriously, we have to equip. Oh, there goes one. So there goes one. It's okay. You can come back anytime. So that's all right. I don't have any worries about Samuel because he went to Colombia on a mission trip, right? And this is the kind of commitment, dedication of a young person that is lovely to see, lovely to understand. So anyway, so don't worry about him. So if the church would begin to take life of the mind more seriously, this is the issue. Because right now, if we're not teaching apologetics, if we're not teaching them to learn the evidences, if we're hyping them with emotion, if we're hyping them with other types of teaching and training that is good for us, we need it all spiritually, we have to be well-rounded, but if we ignore the apologetics, it's like we're sending, this is my quote, it's like we're sending soldiers into the heat of the battle. We're not giving them any defensive weapons, we're not giving them any offensive weapons, we're just sending them out there and saying, well, just do your devotions and have a good time. You know, that's kind of what it's like. We have to teach apologetics. We have to study. How do we teach apologetics? We have to study it. We have to dig up the evidences. We have to see why our faith is different, why our faith is based on truth. And this is what apologetics will help us do. So what are the reasons they gave? Let's see if we can get to that. Yep. Okay, so here's what young people are saying, younger persons. In up to about age 25, I think we're in the survey. Isolation, okay, up to 29 it says. We demonize everything outside the church, including music, movies, culture, technology, define the generation. Even in my generation, my parents thought that the Beatles were horrible. You can't listen to those guys. You can't listen to the Beatles. Now, for those of you who ever look back at a 1964, 1966 clip of the Beatles, you see them in suits and ties and short hair. It's like short hair. But I can remember my dad saying, those long-haired Beatles, I would just hold them down and shave that head off right there. You know, I'm going like, okay, I guess I'll listen to the Beatles somewhere else. You know, I wasn't going to not listen to the Beatles. I like that music. It was great, right? But this is the problem with it, right? So all those things. So this is isolationism, and they're blaming the church for much of this. Shallowness. A third call it boring. A fourth say faith is irrelevant. Bible teaching is unclear. When you look at all the different denominations and the choices we have that were mentioned earlier as well, there are lots of choices and different ideas, and so it's unclear which one do we follow. And even as Serena alluded, whether we have woman in the pulpit or not is a big debate. The churches can't agree, right? And yet when you look at the scripture, I know how I feel about it. And the fact that we're all here, I think we know how most of us feel about it. You know, so how do we find different things? I mean, it's very interesting to see the differences that occur. The Bible teaching is shallow and unclear. It's anti-science. They say that the church doesn't follow science. And I love being a creationist and an intelligent design advocate. I love that. I take all my science. I just love studying it and bringing it together to show how glorious God's creation is, how powerful the story of Genesis is. They're wonderful. I spend a lot of time reading in that kind of area, and it is wonderful. So we shouldn't think that the church is anti-science. It is not. It is not. Our interpretation, and those who are outside the church want you to believe, they want others to believe that the church is anti-science. But it's not. Just come and listen to us. Sex. Can I say that out loud in church? Here we go. I'll have to have a counseling session with the pastor later. Anyway, they're saying, look, it's too simplistic and judgmental. Young people are saying this, that you've all heard, just say no. You've heard that philosophy? The survey says, no. It's not, that doesn't work. Just say no doesn't work. We need the evidence. There are evidences for how to develop it. What was the purpose of our sexuality? How do we apply it in a God-given context? There's purpose. We learn that here, and it's good truth. So they're just saying no is insufficient. We can't just stop there. Exclusivity. 3 in 10 young people feel the church is too exclusive. And that means that we're not allowing others, even different denominations, but other faiths. We're saying that we are the only ones. And 30% say, yeah, I don't know about that. Some of the questions on the board at the back reflect that as well. And then doubters. The church is not a safe place to express doubts. Said over 1/3 of the young people, and 1/4 have serious doubts that they would like to discuss. So we'd like to discuss it. And even as adults, we should be interested in talking to each other. We should be taking time, even whether Sunday morning or other times, and saying, hey, you know what I read? Here's something I read. I found this really interesting. And just sharing ideas, sharing things, and letting it spread through. So we need to be able to do that. So if those things were going on true, how do young people find answers? How do they find answers? Apparently not in the church. So what do you think their beliefs and their faith, where is it going to go? If we don't teach them apologetics, if we don't teach them how to defend the faith and how to encourage the evidence we do have, they will be going outside, not in the church. You must be doing that for me, Rob, are you? Thank you. You're very good at that, because that didn't seem to be working for me. Okay, so got questions. So here's another study from Barna. And again, 36%, 1/3 of young people, they felt they couldn't ask life's most pressing questions. 1/3 of young people feeling, I can't ask that question in church. I can't ask my parents. I can't ask that. Here's a quote from Sean McDowell's group. He said, my friends were concerned that I was following a religion and reading a book that was primitive, ancient, uneducated people. That's what you hear. Has anybody ever heard that? Oh, the Bible's just a bunch of old tales, just a story, And we have evidence that that's not the case. The evidence is a lot more than that. And so he said, the more I read and studied, the more my confidence in Christianity grew, right? The more I read, and that's again what I'm asking you to do. Take a look. I said the Lee Strobel's books, very easy to read. Josh McDowell's books, and Sean McDowell's, his son now, has a PhD in the faith. He followed his father's footsteps. A couple of books at the back that show what they've been writing. Excellent defenses of the faith on all accounts. Okay, so it's great. Okay, next one. And again, another 2018. So this is not old information. I'm not feeding you stuff that's too old. 2018 is not that far out of the realm of our current time. But they basically said that the biggest reasons for millennials to reject the Christian faith, so some of them are a bit older. Again, science refutes the Bible. No, it does not refute the Bible. It does not refute the Bible, not even close. So we have to deal with that. And then refusal to believe in fairy tales. Young people saying, they're raised to think, it's just some stories. Just some stories, interesting stories. Maybe the stories of Jesus are kind of interesting, but they're just stories. And in that kind of context, you also hear the idea, well, Jesus may have been an interesting teacher, but God, no, I don't think so. Well, that goes against what Jesus taught. If you thought he was a good teacher, you should look at what he taught. And what he taught, he did teach. He said, what did he say? Look at the evidence. Healings, the blind. People walk. People are relieved from their pain. They're relieved from their sorrows. They're given confidence. They're given all those things. Jesus said, look at the evidence. So no, he wasn't just a good teacher. He wasn't just a good moral man. He was God. Jesus Christ is the Lord God. So these are all tied up with teaching of Genesis and some other things. So go ahead. Okay, so here's another one. Nancy Pearcey has worked in this field for many, many years. Her book is a little challenging if people want to look at something that's a little bit more challenging, a little deeper. If you've been doing some reading in apologetics and you want to study that, she said, Finding Truth, 5 Principles of Unmasking Atheism, Secularism, and Other God Substitutes. Excellent book. And here in the above part, she's just saying, look, people are getting into college and they're getting taught that Christianity is just a values choice. And we buy that. It's hard to argue against that if you're not prepared. It's hard to understand that you're not just teaching values choices, you're teaching about truth, justice, the future, salvation. You're teaching these things, so that's difficult. Dylan was an individual who Nancy used several times in her book, and here's the toothbrushing example. They were teaching him the basic gospel message. They were teaching him that and encouraging him and uplifting him, but they did not teach him what it tells us to do in 2 Corinthians, destroy the arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. Destroy it. We have the evidence. Destroy the arguments. It really isn't a close contest if you figure it out. It's not a close contest at all. So, just like brushing your teeth, Dylan doesn't have a chance in that kind of environment unless we provide the evidence. Okay, go ahead. So, what do we need to know? We're almost done. Okay, what do we need to know? Okay, there's really, Sean McDowell in their books, they really take a look at this, and they say there's just really 3 groups of topics that we need to look at. The inspiration and trustworthiness of the Bible. Because we need to do that because as we respond to individuals, then they'll ultimately always come back and go, yeah, but it's the Bible, and everybody knows that's just a fable. It's just that was written hundreds of years after Jesus, which is not true. Hundreds of years after, and it's just got a bunch of stuff in it. It contradicts itself, which is not really true. There are some interesting things in there that you can look at if you study. But it doesn't contradict itself on any of the major things that we need to know, like salvation and our future, right? No contradictions there. So people are saying, they'll always come back to that. So we need to teach people why the Bible is more credible. Why is it more credible than our other faiths? The exclusivity idea, we come down to the world religions part. Exclusivity. What about the Muslims? What about the Jewish people? What about the others? Our religions are exclusive. Just what's one of the common answers? Well, all religions lead to the same God. Do you know what? What do you think the real answer to that question is? No. No, they don't. And we need to be there. But you can't just believe that Jesus is the only way. And do you know one of the answers to that? Why not? Right? See, we have to be taught to how to push back. If we're always on the defensive, if we're always sitting there thinking we have to be defending and they're just attacking, it's hard to do that. But it's very interesting if you turn the tables around and go, well, hang on. If you say Jesus is not the only way, what is your evidence? You give me your evidence. And then I begin to pull at their evidences until they turn around and run away. So, you see, we don't have to be afraid of it, but we're thinking we're backed into a corner, always trying to answer everything. And that's not what you always have to do. Sometimes you turn it around. So you don't think Jesus is the only way? Why not? You tell me. You tell me why Jesus isn't the only way. Right? So that's another idea. Again, not to argue, not to get into heated arguments at least, but push back. It's okay to push back. Because we have the evidence. We have good evidences. We have lots of evidence about Jesus, the middle point here, and his resurrection. It's very overwhelming that Jesus died, that he was buried. They knew where his body was buried. He was sealed in the tomb. And you know what? They went back to look later. He was gone because he's been raised from the dead. And there's lots of evidence. That's just the summary. You can dig in. You could spend a week looking at each of those parts of the topic. See, we need to be ready to say that. And particularly at Easter, it's a great time. I was talking with somebody who raised a question or a comment, and I said, well, Christianity really, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, Christianity means nothing. We're all hanging on the idea that Jesus raised from the dead because that's the proof that he's God. That's the proof of our salvation in him, is that he did rise from the dead. Okay, so he basically breaks it up into the three areas about the Bible, who is Jesus, and then we need to understand some things of the world religions are teaching us. Okay, next one. And this is the last slide. Thank you for being so patient. So, what's the problem we face in evangelism? What's the problem we face in presenting the gospel today to others, to telling them the truth? The problem is we have an absolute truth. We have an absolute truth. But it's a relativistic culture, postmodern, metamodern. Everything's okay. There is no sin. Anybody does whatever they want. So we've got an absolute truth. They know we have the truth, and they're not believing. It's an exclusivist message, and we're presenting that the culture is pluralistic. They think everybody has their own right to do whatever they want, right? And everybody's accepted. And there's just one God somewhere, and we need to know. So all of that, and then finally, we're presenting a supernatural being, a creator God, a miracle God, a miracle working God. And they go, no, we're just a bunch of atoms that coincidentally, somehow, we don't know how, but yet it formed life somehow. And you go, where's your evidence for that? Where is your evidence? And we know better. We know better. But not everybody does. Because in some cases, no one has taught them the apologetics of creation about God. So, Eric, yep. Can you pick up the handheld, please? Behind you? Oh, it's on? Yep. It's on? It's on? Testing? Okay. So anyway, to finish that thought, I just want to bring you back one more time. Apologetics responds to the kinds of questions we're doing. The youth are in high school, age 15, 60% of them are walking away from church. They're walking away. And they're saying the church it's too exclusive, it doesn't have the answers I want, I can't even ask the questions I want. That's what they're saying. And so we need to be able to open ourselves to the teaching to be able to do this, because this is also the model that Jesus used. So just to finish again, close with a thought, as I said earlier, believe me that I am in the Father's in me. Otherwise, if you don't just believe what I'm saying, in other words, right? Otherwise, believe because of the works themselves. Look at the evidence. So that's the message I have for you today. And please get some studies, get some looking. Do this in your groups, in your life groups. Study some things that are interesting, a little bit of factual things here and there. Understanding the life and times of Jesus, understanding the culture, understanding all these things, understanding miracles. Miracles. There's evidence for miracles. And that's how we want to leave it for this morning. So thank you for your attention. Do you want to close for me? Who? Worship team. Right. There we go. So thank you for your attention.